going to get started. I know some folks are still transitioning from the previous session into the Zoom room, but welcome. So nice to see you. I see some familiar names and looking forward to connecting with some new folks as well. My name is Stacy Barter. I'm the executive director of a not-for-profit organization called Building Resilient Neighborhoods, and I'm so excited to be hosting this session and joined with my collaborators who are going to be sharing some knowledge and wisdom from their experience, Eva Bogdan and Judy McMillan-Evans, if you want to give a wave. And so this is the session that we have called From Preparedness to Resilience, Building Social Infrastructure to Respond to Climate Impacts and Emergencies. And before we get going, I know that many of us are joining from different parts of BC and even beyond. I just want to acknowledge that I'm joining from my home in the Algonquin-speaking territory on Vancouver Island. And so grateful all the time to be here and to the people who have stewarded this land for so long. And I think it's really important whenever we're talking about social resilience to acknowledge the social resilience of Indigenous peoples and how much we have to learn from them, and also how important it is that we engage in reconciliation as part of our social resilience efforts. So I'm going to go ahead and share my slides and tell you a little bit of what we have planned before we move to some introductions with you. Today's session is really focused around this core question, exploring how can we intentionally build social resilience as part of the process to responding and adapting to climate change, as well as other shocks and stressors that communities are facing. And as I mentioned, there's 3 of us who are going to be sharing a little bit from our experience, and we've designed a session that we hope is fairly interactive so we can hear from all of you as well. So in addition to myself, we have Judy McMillan-Evans, who's a community member in High River, Alberta, and she's going to be sharing about her experience with the flood in High River and what that taught her and others about social resilience. And Judy's also worked with Eva Bogdan, our 3rd speaker, in the co-design of a really great program called We're Ready. So we're going to be hearing about that program as well. And then Eva Bogdan is a community disaster engagement specialist who's also a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Waterloo and has done a lot of really important research in this field. So I'm really pleased that we get to learn from both of their experiences. So just a quick snapshot of what we have planned. So we'll start just with a little bit of an overview of social resilience and what we mean when we're using that terminology, some of why we think this is so important. Then we'll hear from Judy, about her experience in High River with the flood. And Eva will then follow up to share some of the learnings related to that experience, but also looking at research across Canada and highlighting some promising approaches to building social resilience in communities. And then after our short presentations, we'll move into a breakout group activity where you'll get to interact with each other and share some of your thoughts and experiences about the opportunity to strengthen social resilience. I know this whole conference is virtual, so this is probably old hat for everyone, but just a reminder that when we're on Zoom, let's be patient with each other. If anything isn't working with tech, we're so grateful to have Lisa here to be supporting technology. If you need anything, please do find a way to let us know. We'll keep ourselves on mute until we get to the breakout rooms and the discussions. And depending on what version of Zoom you have, if you have the newest version in the reactions tool, which is in the main toolbar at the bottom of your screen, there is the raise your hand function. So when we get to the latter part of the session for discussion, you can feel free to use that. And really encourage you to use the chat to let us know about any questions or comments or reflections as we go through the session. We haven't built in a lot of time for questions with the speakers. So if you have any questions specific for us, I'd really encourage you to use the chat and we'll find a way to make sure we get to your questions. Okay, so enough from me. I'm going to pull up some polls to find out a little bit about who's here today. And unfortunately, because we're a larger group, we don't have time to do a go around to hear from everyone. So I've just posted a poll which asks what region you're participating from. and or are you participating from outside of BC? So I'll give folks just a couple minutes to let us know where you are. It's like just a couple more votes to come in, and then I'll go ahead and broadcast that in just a second. Okay, I'm going to assume that's everyone. So interesting. There's a lot of us, Vancouver Island Central Coast, and lots of Kootenay Rockies folks, a handful from the Lower Mainland, Fraser, Vancouver Coast, and Thompson, Okanagan. And nice to see we've got one person from outside of BC and one person from the North Coast as well. Great. So I've got a few polls, again, just to get a snapshot of who's here. So in addition to geography, we're curious what sectors people represent. We may not have a comprehensive list here, so if you don't see yourself represented in any of these, feel free to just type into the chat, and maybe Eva or Judy, because I can't see the chat while this is happening, you can let me know if there's any others other than what's on the poll. And I'll just give folks a couple minutes to fill that out.
We've got a representative from the provincial government here.
Great. Oh yes, there should have been a different levels of government. So that's wonderful. Thanks for flagging that. Sometimes when we put these polls together quickly, we end up missing important ones. Okay, so let's see. Lots of community NGOs and nonprofits. That's great to see. Quite a few academics, quite a few consultants, and then a handful of local government elected and staff, some health sector, and we have one person from business or industry, which is great to see. Thank you. Okay, a couple more. This is just giving us a little bit more of a sense, again, of where you are and what you're concerned about in terms of emergencies, because a lot of our discussion is going to be focused on how to strengthen emergency preparedness. So this is asking about natural hazards that you're most concerned about impacting your community. And you can see there are a number of choices. I'm suggesting maybe just choose the top 3 that seem most relevant to where you live or in the community where you are. Okay, I'll just give a couple of more minutes. I know there's several choices there. Great. And so floods are the big one, with a follow-up close behind with wildfires or forest fires. Also, it looks like extreme weather, heat waves are also concerns, in storm surge or tsunamis as well. Okay, interesting. So yeah, that makes sense given the regions that we have represented here today. This question is going in a little bit of a related but different focus, asking about not just those kind of big events or acute shocks or natural hazards, but other types of chronic stresses that may be impacting people in your community. So when we think about longer term resilience, thinking about these things that may have impact on us over a longer time period that are chronic stresses. Which ones, again, maybe choosing the top 3. And you don't need to overthink it, just community has concerns. Okay. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and share that. So inequity, social inequities being a big concern for everyone. And of course, that links to many of these other issues that are named here as well, like water and food security, economic security, social isolation. So that makes sense that that's a strong focus, as well as a big concern around mental health and mental well-being. Okay, I think this is our final intro Oh, almost our final one. Two more. What motivated you to attend this session? Again, if you're not seeing your reason here, you can pop it into the chat and let us know. Let's see the votes coming in quickly. All right, so sounds like the top reason is people are looking for practical examples of how to foster preparedness and resilience in the community. Also, a number of people saying it relates directly to their work. They're generally interested in the topic or interested in implementing or adapting existing programs in their community. So our final introductory poll, which I wish I could ask, we could go around in here. But given that we are in the pandemic, living our lives on Zoom, this is just bringing a little levity to our engagement. The question is, are you wearing pants or pajamas on this Zoom call? And so we'll see what the winner is with this crowd. Okay, almost all the votes in. Oh, I don't want to spoil it, but okay. So this is a bit more of a serious crowd, lots of pants in the crowd that people are saying they need some sense of normal, but there's a lot of secretive people that don't want to tell. So that's fine, we will respect your privacy around that. Okay, thanks so much, everyone. It's great to just kind of get a quick sense of who's here. I wish we had time to go around and hear from everyone, but given that we don't, it's nice to just get a quick snapshot. So we're going to move into a little bit of short presentations from myself and Eva and Judy, just to sort of set the stage for our breakout group conversations. Before I do, Judy, Eva, I just want to see if there's anything that you want to add before we dive in. Nope, good. Okay, great. I will go ahead and share my screen again. Okay, so I just wanted to do a really quick introduction, again, just to make sure we're all on the same page as we move into our conversations today around what we mean by social resilience and why we've chosen to focus on this for this particular session today. So I think all of us are feeling the impacts in so many ways of these colliding issues in our communities that are calling on us to be resilient. So it's not just climate change. I know this conference is about climate change and the impacts of climate change, but really the intersection of climate change with these other issues around growing inequality, growing social isolation, and issues around declining health that really call on our communities. And then that trickles down to our households that around the need to be more resilient. And generally, I think all of us are recognizing, and even more so, I think, with the current pandemic, that we're feeling this increasing number of shocks, as well as the chronic stressors that we were speaking about earlier. So this session and a lot of the work that Judy and Eva and I have been doing, we're interested in how can we be better prepared for those shocks, but also use that process of becoming more prepared to strengthen our resilience. And not just to those big events that we were talking about, but some of those chronic stresses that we feel as a result of climate change and health issues, et cetera. The pandemic is a perfect example of where we had that initial shock of the outbreak, or I'll speak for myself, I had the initial shock experience of the outbreak, but we know that it's the longer term impacts and the stress, the ongoing stress of this situation that are calling on us to be resilient for the long haul. So this is from some of the work we are doing in Victoria with our program called Connect and Prepare, but we're really trying to, in our partnership with City of Victoria emergency management shift from what has typically been a more traditional approach to emergency preparedness, where there's typically been a focus on just those big events and really at the individual and household level being prepared. We know that's important, but in order to use the process of preparedness to build social resilience, we're shifting to more of a focus on collective preparedness, rather than just focusing on plans. How do we use this process to build and strengthen social networks and relationships, moving beyond just short-term response to the longer-term resilience. And instead of focusing only on disasters and risks, framing and focusing on community strengths as an opportunity to build resilience. And again, the pandemic is a perfect example of shifting from the traditional frame of, bounce back the same to the notion of we can actually use the experiences of big events or stresses to build back better. And there's increasing evidence to show that it actually isn't the things that we have typically emphasized in traditional emergency preparedness that make the difference when disasters do hit. So this is an article about the 2011 tsunami and earthquake in Japan, where they studied many different communities and neighborhoods and how they fared in terms of disaster recovery. And the findings really emphasize that at the end of the day, it's actually not so much the supplies, the emergency things like bottled water and batteries that make the difference, but in fact, our social networks. So the invitation that we're exploring is how do we, of course, make sure we have those supplies and those things that are important in our emergency kit, but that we move from a focus just on what is in our kit to who is in our kit and strengthening relationships and social networks and communities. So in doing this, when we talk about community resilience, we're really emphasizing building up those kind of core muscles that we believe once you have these capacities that you can intentionally strengthen, communities can be better able to proactively respond and adapt to all different kinds of change or stress or uncertainty. And we really emphasize that for true resilience, we need to be ensuring that everyone's basic needs are being met. And so really tending to those that are the most vulnerable and most at risk. Eva shared this great article with me that was a review of 650 different community resilience approaches. And these are the 9 elements they said in terms of disaster resilience are really important in communities. And I've highlighted 4 that we're going to be looking at, particularly today with the focus on social resilience. So local knowledge, community networks and relationships, preparedness and mental outlook that I think we can build through the process of relationship building and strengthening social connections in communities. And this is from another study, an article that talks specifically when we think of social resilience about 3 key capacities. And this, won't be a surprise to many of you, but the first is just the ability to cope, those capacities. How do we intentionally strengthen our capacity to cope? The second is that adaptive capacity, so the ability to actually be proactive in response to stresses that come our way. But the third that I think is really critical and is really important through social processes is also our transformative capacity. So that's the notion of build back better or bounce forward instead of bouncing back. So how can we strengthen our ability to actually be able to transform the underlying conditions that are sometimes causing some of the issues that are at hand? We know that social networks are so key for being resilient, and social connectedness is really, we call it like the magic ingredient of resilience. But at the same time, we're also experiencing a crisis of loneliness and isolation. In the States, they've declared a loneliness epidemic. This is an article from the UK where they designated a minister for the lonely. So it's so critical, and yet we are in a crisis state around people's level of connectedness. So again, our invitation and our exploration is how do we design our approaches in communities so that we're having the co-benefits of addressing this critical issue around social isolation and lack of social connection while strengthening our resilience and emergency preparedness. So I'm going to pause there. I'm going to pull up another poll again, just to kind of make sure we're hearing a little bit from you in the ways that we can about your own experience of connectedness, if knowing that this is such a key component of community resilience and social resilience. So it's a longer poll. There's actually several questions you can see here, but it's asking you to indicate your level of agreement with a series of statements about your own level of connection where you live and with your neighbors. Much of our work emphasizes connections really at the micro scale with neighbors who are immediately those people who likely will be your first responders in the event of an emergency. So you can see the first one, the statement is, the majority of people in my community know what to do to prepare for emergencies and are taking action to be prepared. So you can vote what level of agreement you have with that. Second one, my community has a strong culture of neighbors helping neighbors. Third, in the event of an emergency, I know which of my neighbors might need help or support. I feel comfortable asking my neighbors for help. And then the last two questions are specific to the pandemic, whether the pandemic has made you feel more or less connected with your community. So there's quite a few there. I'll just give folks a few minutes to go ahead and weigh in there, and then it'd be interesting to see what their responses are. Okay. Okay, I can see there's a few more votes to come in, so I'll just wait a couple more minutes before I close the poll if you want to get your last comments in there. All right, so let's have a look here. The first statement, majority of people in my community know what to do to prepare for emergencies and are taking action to become prepared. Leaning towards the somewhat disagree. So it sounds like that is not overall not as strong maybe as people might like or hope. Some are somewhat agreeing. No one's totally agreeing. So that's interesting for us to know and think about as we move into conversation today. My community has a strong culture of neighbors helping neighbors, more on the somewhat agree side. So that is nice to see. And I know we have a lot of smaller communities represented today, and typically, not always, but often that is more of a culture in smaller communities. So that's often a strength. In the event of an emergency, I know which of my neighbors might need help or support. People are leaning towards agreeing with that. Some not so sure. I feel comfortable asking my neighbors for help. Lots of totally agree. Oh, that's great. That's great to see. We don't always see that. Often people are able to offer help but feel less comfortable asking for help. So that's refreshing. And then the last two around the pandemic, has the pandemic made me feel more or less connected? People are generally saying they disagree that it's made them feel more connected and leaning towards less connected. So that's interesting. We get different answers about that. It's interesting. The pandemic has in some ways facilitated more connection for some people. So it varies. Okay, wonderful. Thanks for sharing that. And I hope that those will spark some things for us to hold as we move into our conversations later. Bridging from what I shared about the overall why we think social resilience is important, I'm going to invite Judy to share about her experience with the High River flood. And so glad that you're here, Judy, to share like a real life practical example where we can see if these theories and ideas of resilience actually land and ground truth them a bit. So over to you.
Okay, so I muted. Lisa, can you?
We can hear you, Judy.
Okay, I was unmuting and yet it showed that I was still muted. Interesting. Um, so I've been a long-term resident of High River, and High River is located about a half an hour south of Calgary on the Highwood River, and we are about a half an hour east of the edge of the mountains. So High River has traditionally flooded every decade or so. It's not consistent, but for instance, 1995, 2005, and then in 2013 again, and many times prior to that. So if we can change the slide. All right. So this is what we experienced. On June 20th, 2013, there was heavy rains in the mountains and there was a heavy snowpack, and the rain added to the rapid melt brought the river down. And so a lot of southern Alberta was impacted, but High River was impacted the biggest. And let's go to the next slide. You can see from this picture, 95% of our community was flooded. And not just with floodwaters, but also what happened is when the water entered the sewer system, it pressurized. And so a lot of the damage in our homes and our buildings was from that massive pressurization. So not just in our homes and businesses where the floodwaters in the sewer came into the house like a geyser, it also did severe damage to the infrastructure under the ground in our water and sewer systems. So we had a heck of a mess on our hands. And of course, it was June 20th. It was the days after the flood. It got very hot, so high humidity. And what a lot of us had to deal with was not just in the recovery process, was not just the residual water, mud, and sewer, but mold. So when you look at it from a community perspective, what happened is, because we were not prepared for looking out for each other, so that whole community resilience process, many people got left behind. And that's, in my perspective, what we're trying to do with all the work in communities, is make sure no one gets left behind. So left behind physically and emotionally. Just to give you an example, our next door neighbor is quite reclusive. She is a senior single lady who lives alone and does not interact much in the community. I was not in the community when it flooded, and no one thought about her. She was still in her home 3 days later with no phone, no cell phone, no electricity, no water, and no gas. And it wasn't until a family member came to the edge of town, because we were all evacuated, and let the first responders know that she was probably still in her home. So it was an interesting process and an interesting lesson for me to realize that she did get left behind because of her lack of interaction with the community. In the recovery process, many people got left behind emotionally and physically because they didn't have the same resilience and didn't have a social network to tap into. So the We're Ready project that Eve and I worked on was all about preparing the community to look out for each other. So there's, if we can change the slide. In other words, this is what took place. After the floodwaters left, of course, we had amazing support from the emergency response teams, the first responders, the emergency, everything. You know, we cannot be thankful enough for the people who came to support us and the financial resources. But there was still stress everywhere, distress, stress. And some people are still, now we're 8 years later, are still in status. Next slide, please. So what excites me about a conference like this, and about the work that people are doing, and that we're learning about how to bring people together is that it's not the responsibility of someone else. It's the responsibility of ourselves to look after our family and the responsibility of ourselves to look after our neighbors. That's really how the world has always functioned. It really should be that case in at a time of disaster. So we need to leave the old way where we've become a society of quite individualized people. And the concept of community is the answer to so much of resilience and recovery. So this slide is all about to find a new way and to keep reminding. So I'll just give you in closing a little bit of context of what's happened. What we're seeing here is the further we get away from the disaster, the more time that goes by, the less prepared we are again. We're going back into that forgetting how to look out for each other, forgetting that we need each other. So the ongoing awareness, training, education, processes, discussions, dialogue, whatever it takes, we need to make sure that these social networks are constantly in place and constantly being built upon. Thank you.
Thanks, Judy. Great. I'm going to invite Eva to build on some of what you were sharing, because there was so much learning in the High River experience. And I know that that has led to all of this work with the We're Ready initiative and others. So I'll turn it over to Eva to share more about some of the learnings from this particular experience and how that connects with other national research.
I'm delighted to be here with you all today. And as Stacy mentioned, I study disasters. Specifically, I'm a disaster and environmental sociologist. I trace how disasters are socially constructed through decisions made, such as land use planning and policies, and whether these disasters led to changes for preventing future crises. So currently, I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Waterloo as part of the Effective Flood Risk Governance in a Changing Climate Research Group, shortened to FloodGov, which is a little more catchy, which is led by Dr. Daniel Henstra. So my postdoctoral research is to build capacity for difficult conversations on flood risk management in Canada. We know that these conversations are extremely contentious because they touch on core values of public safety, property rights, and economic security, so finances. Okay. Oh, sorry, I forgot to say next. Okay, next. So flooding is actually Canada's most costly and common hazard. And as Judy mentioned, there was the 2013 Alberta flood, and I did my doctoral research on that, specifically focusing on High River. And that flood was $6 billion in damages, which is the most expensive uninsured disaster. The 2016 Fort McMurray wildfire is now the most expensive disaster, but because many people were able to purchase fire insurance, many of those costs were covered. However, in 2013, there was no overland flood insurance for households available. So that is why it became so expensive, because of the uninsured damages. Now, High River is, as Judy mentioned, the most impacted in 2013 and is very flood prone. In the early 1880s, settlers were drawn to High River area by, there's a ford crossing of the Highwood River, and which it made an ideal condition for ranching, and of course the scenic view of the Rocky Mountains, if any of you have ever been there. And that's also where that TV series had been recorded, and all of a sudden it escapes my mind, but it's a Canadian very popular show about a girl who did horse training. And this location was established to be the town of High River, but it wasn't ideal for the long-term settlement because it actually sits on an alluvial fan. And there's been over 10 major floods occurring between 1894 and 2013. Now, prior to the settlers' arrival, people of the Blackfoot Nation would move from the Highwood River Valley to the escarpment above. And when the snow eaters came, That's what they called the Chinooks, because the Chinooks, when they arrived, they would melt the snow. So they called them the snow eaters. They would move up to the top. They knew not to stay in the valley. And as Jeanette Armstrong in the opening plenary today mentioned, there's many benefits to incorporating traditional ecological knowledge and bringing it together with other types of knowledge. Okay, so my doctoral research was on the social dimensions of the 2013 flood, and I was really interested in understanding flood risk governance in terms of perceptions of flooding, the different decision-making processes and interactions of stakeholders. Next, please. So some of my main findings was that High River residents were not better prepared for not only flooding disasters in the future, but also other disasters such as grass fires or tornadoes. And also that there was a lot of blaming going on between stakeholders as I interviewed them one-on-one. And I thought, if everyone sat in on these interviews, I think they'd have a little bit more understanding and empathy towards the many constraints everybody faced based on their roles and responsibilities. Okay, can you click on the animation, please? So one of my some of my recommendations from my doctoral research was to shift from this emergency management mentality, which is short term, to risk reduction, which is longer term. Again, shifting this culture away from framing disasters as caused by nature, which we've seen our own elected politicians say that it was acts of God and Mother Nature, which really obscures the fact that there were certain decisions made which put people in harm's way, such as constructing in high-risk flood areas. And also to shift from this government to governance, where there's more balanced apportionment of risk and responsibility. So for those who are making decisions that end up increasing vulnerabilities, that they also shoulder the costs of those as opposed to having it downloaded to others. Next, please. Now, just following up to recommendation number 3, which was this more balanced risk apportionment. On March 1st, we had some breaking news in Alberta that the provincial government announced that from now on, municipalities will have to cost share disasters, which means they're going to have to start paying 10% of disaster damages. And I don't know if this is also how you do it in BC. And also that there's going to be a limit in the amount of assistance provided to each household to a maximum of 500,000, and yeah, a one-time assistance. All right, thank you very much. Next one. So with this, hearing all the stakeholders, finger pointing, I was inspired to co-design the Flood Resilience Challenge game. And I was also inspired because I took a trip to the Netherlands to learn more about the Room for the River program, and they actually played a serious role-playing game, and it helped them to better understand each other's different perspectives and interests and help them to work together better afterwards. So the purpose of the Flood Resilience Challenge game is to build the capacity of stakeholders to improve flood resilience and enhance the flood risk governance, so the decision-making, including collective decision-making. And it does so by increasing flood literacy of different concepts, fostering the social learning, and that's shifting from individual perspectives and individual interests to more the collective interests and collective well-being, and also creating a safe space for exploring both risk management and communication strategies. So often people are restricted in what ideas, actions, and what they can say based on their roles and responsibilities. And this role-playing game actually helps them to play a different role and understand different perspectives and different constraints of those roles. Next, please. And then, as Judy mentioned, residents in High River were not necessarily better prepared for future disasters, and that's how the We're Ready workshops was born. It was co-designed by a volunteer committee from the town of High River, including Judy, and then the then Director of Emergency Management and other individuals as well. We've run 3 pilots of We're Ready. One was in May 2016, we started. One was for an ethnic community, and one was for a geographical community. And then 3 years later, we ran it at the University of Alberta for faculty, staff, and students. And Judy and I are now in the process of moving it online, and it will be implemented through the Tamarack Institute for free on May 27th. And you can find out more information from that website, we'reready.org. And there's also a video explaining more of the We're Ready program and the High River Committee members explaining their role in it on this website. Next, please. So my finding that the town of High River residents were not well prepared for disasters is actually not unique in Canada. 85% of Canadians agree that disaster preparation is important, but only about 40% are actually prepared. And there's lots of pressure on limited emergency municipal resources, even though municipalities respond to about 90% of emergencies. And there's often also lack of culturally appropriate programs, not just in Canada, but in the United States as well. And this became very clear during Hurricane Katrina for them. Next, please. So the purpose of We're Ready is to design and implement, communities to design and implement their own disaster programs, and for it to be really hands-on, interactive, and fun, and for community building activities. So instead of people being lectured at and just sitting there, every activity is interactive, and it's one of its goals is to build social connections. Next, please. So some of the deliverables are hazard and evacuation maps, and you can see one of the workshop participants here building their community map using arts and craft supplies, communication plans, community capacity inventory. Next. So here are some of the activities that we do. We do a pre-workshop and a post-workshop survey, because one of the challenges of these types of workshops is that often there's no measurement, and so it's difficult to actually gauge how effective it was. And number 2 is community bingo, and you can see the community bingo sheet that we used here, which helps. It's an icebreaker. It helps members to get to know each other. All right. And we also do a simulation activity, number 6. For the High River, it was a tornado, and then for the University of Alberta, it was an ice storm. So you can really pick whichever disaster you want. Next. Over to you, Stacy.
Great, thanks, Eva. Can you hear me? Oh,
Yes.
yeah, okay. Sorry, I was trying to get my mute off. I was so excited to learn about the We're Ready program, because I think it hits on so many of the points that we've been talking about how do we go beyond traditional preparedness and actually use it as an opportunity to build those connections and resilience through the process. And here on Vancouver Island, as I mentioned earlier, with Building Resilient Neighborhoods, we've had the privilege of partnering with the City of Victoria on a similar initiative that we call Connect and Prepare. There's a lot of similarities with the We're Ready program, but particularly emphasizing the intersection of these 3 points of emergency preparedness, social connectedness, and fostering neighbors helping neighbors. So similar in some ways to We're Ready, a little bit distinct in terms of the structure. So it really emphasizes bringing neighbors that are really close together. So at the block level, or in rural communities, it might be those that are most adjacent or apartment buildings. And we work with groups of residents through a series of workshops that look at both the opportunity to become more prepared and to become more connected as neighbors, with some of the same deliverables and outputs as the We're Ready initiative. This is sort of the flow. Neighbors come together, go through a process of assessing collective strengths and vulnerabilities, assets and needs, design a plan, a customized plan and strategy to strengthen connections and resilience. And that varies. So some groups have really gone down the path of emergency preparedness and focused in on their plans, their buddy systems to help each other out, their shared emergency supplies, looking at things like that. But often they're enhancing beyond just that focus to also how do they stay more connected as neighbors. So we've seen things like skill sharing workshops that neighbors do together, looking at what are the strengths and skills we have as a group of neighbors, block parties, any kind of gatherings, potlucks, etc., things that neighbors can do to just in an ongoing way stay connected and check in on each other. So a strong focus on mutual aid and developing plans and projects together. And so they come away doing projects which we incentivize with small micro grants. And our theory is that it actually isn't really about the project, it's about the process of working together on the project that makes the difference. But we have seen some really fun and interesting projects that have come out. So these are some of the things that we offer. Similarly, a kind of a suite of resources and materials. We also incentivize it with the city offering $500 worth of shared emergency supplies. So beyond the individual supplies that people may have in their household, what do neighbors need collectively that can help them out? And as I mentioned, the micro grants that kind of help incentivize doing things together and actually taking action. And it's been really interesting to see how very small grants kind of remove the psychological barrier of doing things, and a small carrot can be motivating to actually taking action together. So back to you, Eva, to share some of the themes across all of these initiatives.
Thank you. And I forgot to mention with the We're Readies that all of those activities actually have on the website, there's detailed instructions on how to run each of those activities and the entire workshop in your own community, and it's all for free. So including everything from the promotional materials to the registration process to the workshop surveys, it's all available on there. A list of materials you need to consider and so forth. It's all available on we'reready.org. And that there were 3 spin-off projects from the We're Ready workshops by participants. And so as Stacy mentioned, a lot of it is just getting people to work together, and then it can inspire future projects. It's really important. So some of the common themes with what you've heard so far today is the importance of shifting from individual and household level to the whole community level and away from emergencies and crises to overall resilience. Also, the neighborhood-based approach to disasters is really important. They already take this approach in the Netherlands, Cuba, and Chile, which has resulted in much lower casualty rates for hurricanes, floods, and earthquakes. And the literature very strongly indicates that relationships and strong social ties are one of the most important factors in emergency response and recovery, and that they also help build resilience. Also, that these disaster programs are more successful when they are community driven. So to have that community ownership and to have that place-based kind of engagement. Thank you.
Thanks, Eva. That was great. I'm going to pause just before we transition into breakout groups for the rest of you to get to engage and talk about some of these ideas and where you see opportunities, or maybe some of the challenges that you want to support each other to think through together. We don't have a lot of time for questions, and we really want to stay focused on engaging together. But if there are any clarifying questions, we could take a couple right now if anyone has anything that they're wanting to clarify with either myself or Eva or Judy. Okay, sounds like we're good. All right, well, let's move into having some discussion. That's what we really want. So we're going to move into smaller breakout groups of about 5 people and invite you to have a conversation about social resilience in your community. And I'll pull up the 3 questions to start that we're inviting you to engage with. And then I'm going to introduce you to a little bit of a template that we've set up for you to work through. So the 3 questions we're inviting you to talk about as a small group are, first of all, what are some examples of how your community is already working to build social infrastructure that can support preparedness and resilience? Second of all, what do you think needs to shift in our communities and organizations to more intentionally support this? And third, what do you see as one opportunity to strengthen this approach in your particular community or organization? And one of the things I think I see is that this is kind of everybody and nobody's business. So an overarching question that I'm holding is, how do we strengthen investment and commitment when we know how important this work is? How do we strengthen that in our communities? So what we're going to do is we'll move into breakout groups, and I'm going to set you up with a virtual whiteboard. And I'll invite you to take your first 5 minutes just individually to respond to the 3 questions with some virtual sticky notes. I'll show you the whiteboard in just a minute. So first 5 minutes, just on your own, reflect, jot down your ideas, do a little individual brainstorm. Then as a small group, you can open up for discussion and start to look at what some of the themes are that you're seeing across your group. And when you're reaching the end of the breakout group, we'll just prompt you to see as a group if you can choose one nugget or takeaway from your conversation to share back with the larger group. So we'll have about 20 minutes, and I'm going to just show you the whiteboard. Just give me 1 second here to make sure I have the right thing opened up to show you what that looks like. So we're using Google Jamboard, which is quite straightforward, I think pretty easy to use. So you'll go into your groups. The one thing that is really important is to please pay attention to the number of your breakout group, because we've created a separate sheet for each group. So you'll see right here, it says group number 1. And at the top of the screen, there's a little arrow that allows you to advance to the next frame. So you'll see this one is group number 2, etc. So you can scroll at the top through the frames to find your group number. And as I said, first 5 minutes, just doing some individual brainstorming around these 3 questions. So this one, what are some examples of how your community is already working to build social infrastructure? So you just click on a sticky note, it'll open up, and then I can type. So in my community, an example of how we're working to build social infrastructure is, I'll just say connect and prepare, because that's what I know. So you can see I've just added it there. So just double click and type. So hopefully that works. I think Lisa has put the Jamboard link into the chat here. So you'll need to grab that link, open it up in a separate browser, and have that open, and then we'll send you off to your breakout rooms. Before we do that, any questions about the mechanics of any of this? Okay, really through community partnerships with organizations that do have connections and relationships already established with different groups of people in the community. So for example, we have a partnership here on the island with Capital Regional Housing that operates a number of social housing sites. And so we work with them directly to do outreach and engagement with their tenants. But that's just one example. I think those partnerships are really, really key. Hi, everyone. Welcome back. Nice to see you all. I was saying I was lurking in the Jamboard, and so I got to see some of the great ideas that were showing up there. Lisa, why don't we put, I think I might just be me. I just want to check that I'm not spotlighted, and okay, good. We can be in gallery view. So people, you might be nice to put us in gallery view for everyone, so you can see everyone, so we can have a little bit of a discussion. Well, let's maybe start with just a go around. There was the invitation. I know it was quite a breadth of questions and they're not light questions, but let's just have a go around to hear from one person from each group if there was sort of a nugget or a place that you landed in your conversation that seemed particularly important or pertinent. So even, I don't know who was in your group, but just someone from, I think you were group 1, right?
Yep, we're group 1. So someone from our group, we came up with a nugget we decided together. So if someone from my group would like to talk about it, if not, I'm happy to do it as well. So please go ahead.
I think Andre, are you trying to speak? Because you're on mute.
Hi there, Andre.
Yeah.
We noticed that often it's not that there aren't networks, it's that there's nothing formal in place to deal with a disaster. And so how do you bridge or shift from lots of informal networks where neighbors may know each other and help each other to something more formal so that people really know what to do and so that nobody gets left behind?
Yeah, great. That's such a great point. So how do you actually formalize certain aspects of those networks so that in the event of bigger emergencies, there's a bit of formality, because that does make sense in those contexts. Yeah. Great. How about the second group? I don't know sort of who was in which group. I think Judy might have been in group 2. Yeah.
Right. I was typing the notes as the amazing ideas were flowing. Bottom line is there's still lots of denial, and there's lots of education that needs to happen. Emergency plans at the municipal level and the government level are strong and they're great, but that doesn't help you and me as our neighbors and the real citizens in the disaster time and even in the recovery time. So that's our nugget.
That's interesting. Yeah, my own personal opinion, and I think it varies place to place, but what I have seen is that there's often, depending on resources, there may be strong plans in place at the municipal level. In some places, there's a strong emphasis on the individual household level, but then there's kind of this gap with the in-between space, with the neighborhood, the neighbor to neighbor space. Yeah. Great. How about group 3? I'm not sure who was in that group. I wasn't able to join a group. So anyone who wants to share if there was sort of a nugget from that group.
The nugget we chose to bring away was a personal experience of Cache Creeks. We've had a rough few years with fires and floods. And after our flood of 2017, when we tragically lost our fire chief, one of the things that really came to the forefront was that the community wanted to help. They wanted to be involved. So that community involvement is so important. So the following spring, we, with the help of EMBC, had a sandbagging bee, and we got the machine and sand and had a barbecue and music, and was great. And everybody was welcome to just come and pick up as many sandbags as they wanted to take to have preparedness for their area. And again, it was huge. Small towns are great for neighbor helping neighbor. It just happens organically a lot of the time. And the following year we had it again and almost had too many people. Like, word got out about how much fun it was and how great it was, and nice to have those sandbags. We had, of course, COVID happen and weren't able to do it last year and won't be able to do it this year, but we strategically placed sand and bags throughout the community, and people got together and did it themselves. So the key takeaway is that they want to be involved. We just have to figure out the best way to involve them.
Oh, that's great. What a great example, Sue. Thanks for that. And I think you're so right. The piece about finding ways to facilitate community action. We have this narrative about community apathy that I don't know if it's always true. So if we can create pathways and opportunities for that kind of coming together action, I think that often people will want to be part of it. Yeah. I'm curious about the question about what needs to shift. Like I saw some of the comments about, for example, there were a few things around the fact that there's sometimes emergency planning or emergency response planning, but that social resilience isn't necessarily woven into that. I'm curious about other conversations about what might need to shift for this to be more taken up. And just open this floor to anybody who wants to share any reflections around that.
On our board, I noticed one of the things that came up was inclusivity. So avoiding racist stereotypes and images, and involving marginalized people, as well as like involving everybody in the community and not cherry picking, I guess, for lack of a better word, but it's important that you hear all of the voices.
Yeah, I saw that on the board. I was really happy to see that there was a strong focus around inclusion. And again, just want to open the floor to be in dialogue and discussion together. If others have reflections or thoughts about how to do that, or any thoughts related to inclusion. Andre was asking a question when they were just coming back from their group about reaching sometimes harder to reach individuals. And I was sharing that for us, having really strong community partnerships has been really, really core to our approach, so that it's always about finding where those networks are. And often there are different organizations, whether those be faith organizations or community service organizations, who have those relationships with different parts of the community, and working together to be able to facilitate an inclusive space and draw on those existing networks. It's been really important.
I'm wondering, just thinking about this idea of inclusion and drawing on community networks, we typically assume that the wise adults in the room are going to be the people who organize all of this, and they're the only ones who know how to do it. But young people in high school know all about social networking, and rarely do we call upon them to help us plan this kind of thing. And I'm wondering if this is a missed opportunity.
Yeah, what a great comment. I suspect it is.
I just wanted to jump on that with the youth. There's a really great program called Protecting Our Home, and I'll find the link and put it in here. It's involving Indigenous youth in training them in terms of emergency management and preparedness, but also building in traditional ecological knowledge and traditional skills like food preparation into the whole program. So they're being trained to be leaders in their communities now and in the future. And so I will put that link up there. So it's great that whoever brought it up.
Yeah, it's such a fantastic program. Yeah, Leslie, go ahead.
An official hand up on the one of the major shifts. It's systemic shift. I don't know. Transformative shift is. I think we need citizens to come back to their own agency. I think we need people. I feel that my neighborhood needs to believe they are going to take care of each other. There's not some overreaching power that's going to come in. And talking about the High River experience, I think those are examples everywhere, that it is your neighbors. They're your first responders. They're the ones that are going to be there. So we've gone through this curve of having so many agencies and levels of government caring for us, when really, how about and I speak from an age perspective, where that has been a shift from when I was younger, and many of those things are definite benefits. I also grew up in a small town as well as currently living in a small town, and have been in major metropolitan areas in the interim. But many of those ideas that I think are explored in Bolding Alone, I'm sure you've read that book about the shift in the US and in our culture as well. But I think we need to rediscover our agency as citizens to take care of ourselves and affect change in our community to put that structure in place for better communication.
I'm so glad you said that. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think the challenge we have is, as community builders, to think about how can we facilitate that? What can we do that facilitates the development of a sense of agency? I think that's a great question to hold. I mean, certainly we're not going to answer it in the 5 minutes we have remaining, but I think that's a really great question for all of us to be thinking about. And again, one of the things that's been great about working with my local emergency management division is that's where they start, is really saying, hey folks, there's this idea, particularly around emergency management, that the city's going to come in and take care of everything. And that is not what's going to happen. We do not have the resources. So let's start changing that narrative. But I think also the experience of neighbors having positive experience of working together, that does over time really build that capacity. And I really do think of it like one of those core resilience muscles. Like we have a sense of agency. We have a sense that we can do things, and we're the ones that can make a difference. Yeah, I know we need to move to close, but Judy, Eva, any closing thoughts from either of you?
I just wanted to mention that some great resources have been shared in the chat box if you haven't opened it. Sometimes what I like to do is I just like to quickly copy and paste, and then after a webinar, I like to look through. So that's something that might be of interest to you. And the Canadian Red Cross did release a report on how to include high-risk populations into emergency management. And just as Stacy said, it was tapping into existing organizations that are already connected with those populations.
Great, thanks for that, Eva.
That's it. This has been delightful. So thank you so much for the opportunity.
And Judy, before we move to you, thanks for that, Eva. I see, Lori Jo, that you have your hand up, and I just want to make sure we make space before we close if there's a question or comment from you.
Just quick comment about communication and being a good neighbor is how do we deal with a lot of neighborhoods in ski communities where people don't live here full time?
Yeah, it's a great question. And one of the communities we partnered with our Resilient Streets, Resilient Neighbors program was Whistler, where that was really part of the dynamic there. And it was a very different dynamic. I think there are strategies, but it takes extra effort. It really takes extra effort when there's that kind of transience to build a sense of community. I'd be happy to chat offline if you want to chat more about that. Great. Judy, any closing thoughts from you?
I am so excited to be part of this conversation and and to know the kind of work that's taking place. There's so many words of wisdom that have been shared in the last hour and a half. I'm really excited about it, and I'm fired up to do something more in our community. And as I said earlier this morning, the further we get away from a disaster, we fall back into that hole of denial, and we lose the momentum that we had. It needs to be consistent and ongoing, and a great conversation that takes place every day, every week, every year. So thank you for sharing your great ideas today, people. It's been an honor.
Thank you.
And Stacy, sorry, before I forget, there's a really great app called Nextdoor app that I actually just joined in my neighborhood, and it's like a Facebook, but it's not Facebook. And basically you can write, connect with your neighbors about anything to do with safety, or if somebody needs advice or a service and so forth. It's really helpful.
Yeah, I saw quite a few comments about that in the Jamboard. It's a great,
Okay.
Platform for sure. So before you press close, I'd invite each of you maybe just to type in the chat one thing you're taking away from today or still chewing on. That would be great for us to know. And a big thank you to all of you. I did want to say we have not yet, but will upload the slide deck, which also has a closing slide with a number of the resources that are here in the chat as well. So if you want to take a peek at that afterwards, it's all on the Bridging Silos site. So thank you again, everyone. Great to see you all. Nice to see a few familiar faces that I didn't get a chance to say hi to. And be well.